The Alpha looked into his little daughter's tear-filled eyes and chose his kingdom instead. 6-year-old Elara Ashwin stood alone before the towering gates of Ashmore, clutching a small wooden wolf so tightly that its rough edges pressed into her tiny hands. She didn't understand why everyone was staring at her. The warriors who had once smiled at her now stood like statues. The women who had braided her hair lowered their eyes. Even the children she played with hid behind their parents. No one moved. No one spoke. High above them, Alpha Rowan stood on the castle balcony. His face was carved from stone, but behind his silence, his heart was breaking. "Father," Elara's small voice trembled. "Did I do something wrong?" The question echoed across the courtyard. No one answered. Not the council, not the soldiers, not the hundreds of people who had watched her grow from the day she was born. Only the cold morning wind replied. Moments later, the great gates of Ashmore opened, and the little girl the kingdom had called its weakest daughter took her first steps into exile. 20 years later, she would return, not for revenge, not for justice, but to save the very pack that had betrayed her. Please subscribe if you love werewolf romance stories. The story is just beginning. Long before the kingdoms learned to fear the name Elara Ashwin, she was simply a little girl who believed everyone deserved kindness. The kingdom of Ashmore stretched across fertile valleys, ancient forests, and towering mountains. It was the oldest and most respected wolf kingdom in the north, admired for its disciplined warriors and unwavering unity. Every child born within its borders grew up hearing the same words from the day they could understand them. Strength preserves the pack. Those words were carved into the stone walls of the great hall, embroidered onto royal banners, and repeated by every alpha before them. To the people of Ashmore, strength was more than a virtue. It was survival. Alpha Rowan Ashwin had ruled by that belief for nearly 2 decades. He was respected across every neighboring kingdom as a leader who never hesitated when duty called. Under his command, Ashmore had defeated invading armies, survived harsh winters, and protected its people through famine and disease. To his subjects, Rowan was unshakable. Only those closest to him knew there was one person capable of melting the stern expression that rarely left his face: his youngest daughter. Every morning before attending council meetings, Rowan walked through the castle gardens with 6-year-old Elara. She rarely cared about the affairs of the kingdom. Instead, she searched for injured birds, watered flowers the gardeners had already watered, and insisted on greeting every servant she passed by name. One spring morning, Rowan found her kneeling beneath an oak tree. A tiny dove lay on the grass, with one injured wing. "What happened?" he asked. Elara looked up, her emerald eyes already filling with tears. "I think it fell." Rowan knelt beside her. "It may not survive." She gently lifted the trembling bird into her tiny hands. "Then I'll stay with it until it isn't afraid anymore." Rowan smiled despite himself. Most children dreamed of becoming great warriors. His daughter dreamed of comforting frightened creatures. "You have your mother's heart," he said softly. Elara beamed. "Is that a good thing?" "It is." She thought for a moment before asking, "Then why do some people say I'll never be strong?" Rowan's smile faded. Children often repeated the conversations they overheard from adults. Someone had spoken carelessly. He brushed a strand of chestnut hair away from her face. "There are many kinds of strength." She tilted her head. "Which one is the best?" Rowan looked toward the castle walls rising above them. At the time, he believed he knew the answer. "I hope one day I can tell you." Elara accepted the answer with the simple trust only a child possesses. She returned her attention to the little dove. "Don't worry," she whispered. "You'll fly again." Rowan watched her in silence. He never imagined those gentle words would one day define the future of an entire kingdom. That same afternoon, the peace of Ashmore shattered. The warning bells rang from the eastern watchtowers. Soldiers flooded the castle courtyard. Messengers rode through the gates with exhausted horses covered in sweat and dust. A border village had fallen, not to conquest, to destruction. Homes had been burned, storehouses emptied, families forced to flee into the forests. Inside the council chamber, a heavy silence settled over the long oak table. Maps covered every surface. Wooden markers marked damaged villages and weakened defenses. General Darius spoke first. "Our eastern borders grow weaker every season." Another council member nodded grimly. The neighboring kingdoms have begun testing our strength. Master Torin, the oldest advisor in the room, folded his hands. They no longer fear Ashmore as they once did. Rowan remained silent. He studied the map. Every report carried the same warning. The kingdom stood at the beginning of a dangerous age. Then Master Torin spoke the words that changed everything. My Alpha, the people have begun asking difficult questions. Rowan slowly looked up. What questions? The succession. Silence filled the chamber. General Darius shifted uneasily. The nobles believe the next generation must project absolute strength. Rowan's expression hardened. My children are not subjects for political debate. No, Torin replied carefully. But the kingdom believes they are its future. He hesitated before continuing. They fear Princess Alara. The room fell completely still. Rowan stared at him. She is 6 years old. They know. They say she is gentle. They say she is soft. They say the people see kindness where they should see power. Another counselor added quietly. Rumors spread quickly. They say Ashmore has grown weak enough to raise a child who rescues birds instead of learning to fight. General Darius immediately objected. She's a little girl. No one expects her to lead today. Master Torin sighed. No, but symbols shape kingdoms. Every word landed like a stone. Rowan rose from his chair. My daughter is not the reason our enemies attack us. No, Torin answered. But frightened people always look for someone to blame. Underscore. Outside the chamber, Alara sat on the castle steps beside one of the kitchen servants. The old woman struggled to carry a basket overflowing with fresh bread. Without being asked, Alara hurried over and lifted the smaller basket herself. I can help. The servant smiled. You're the Alpha's daughter. So? You shouldn't be carrying bread. Alara laughed. But you're carrying it. The woman smiled warmly. I suppose I am. Together, they delivered fresh loaves to soldiers preparing to ride east. One young warrior accepted the bread with tired eyes. Thank you, Princess. Alara noticed the bandage around his arm. Does it hurt? A little. She tore off a small piece of her own bread and handed it to him. My father says people heal faster when they eat. The soldier laughed. I think your father may be right. None of them noticed the nobleman watching from across the courtyard. He frowned, then quietly walked away. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness create the largest misunderstandings. One from Oath. That evening, Rowan stood alone on the castle balcony. The kingdom stretched before him, peaceful beneath the fading light. Yet his thoughts refused to settle. Footsteps approached behind him. Queen Lyra. She slipped her hand into his. You've been carrying the kingdom all day. He looked at her with tired eyes. The kingdom grows heavier every year. She followed his gaze toward the gardens where Alara chased butterflies beneath the setting sun. Then come down here for a while. Rowan smiled faintly. I still have council reports. They'll still be there tomorrow. She squeezed his hand, gently. Our daughter won't always be 6. For a brief moment, he considered leaving everything behind. Then another messenger climbed the castle stairs. My Alpha, the council requests your presence immediately. The moment disappeared. Rowan looked once more toward Alara. She waved excitedly when she saw him. He waved back. Neither of them knew. It would be the last peaceful evening they would ever share together. The council gathered again before sunrise. No one spoke as servants lit the torches lining the great hall. Their footsteps echoed across the polished stone floor before disappearing into an uneasy silence. Every man seated around the great oak table understood the kingdom stood at a crossroads. Another border village had fallen during the night. More families had fled. More warriors had died. The reports arriving from the eastern frontier painted the same grim picture. Ashmore's enemies were growing bolder. Alpha Rowan stood at the head of the table studying the latest maps. General Darius broke the silence. Our eastern defenses cannot survive another coordinated assault. Another commander nodded. We're fighting 3 kingdoms with the resources of 1. Master Torin slowly folded his hands. My Alpha, the people are becoming frightened. Rowan finally looked up. They should be. They're asking for reassurance. And they believe Ashmore must project absolute strength. Rowan already knew where the conversation was heading. His expression hardened. We've discussed this. Torin answered carefully. The people have not. Another counselor leaned forward. Rumors have become dangerous. What rumors? That the Alpha's own household no longer reflects Ashmore's values. Silence. General Darius immediately frowned. This has gone too far, the noble continued. They say Princess Alara represents mercy when the kingdom requires strength. They say the future Alpha bloodline must inspire warriors, not compassion. Rowan's jaw tightened. My daughter inspires kindness. The counselor met his eyes. Exactly. Underscore. Outside the chamber, Alara wandered through the castle gardens carrying a small wooden bucket. The dove she had rescued the previous morning perched happily upon her shoulder. She stopped beside the elderly gardener. His hands shook as he struggled to lift a heavy watering barrel. Without a word, Alara grabbed the opposite handle. Together, they carried it across the garden. The old man smiled. You've become stronger, she giggled. I thought everyone said I was weak. They're wrong. She looked genuinely confused. Then why do they keep saying it? The gardener hesitated. Children deserved honest answers, but not cruel ones. Sometimes, people become so afraid, they stop seeing what's right in front of them. Alara thought about that for a moment. I hope they stop being afraid. So do I. Underscore. By midday, the entire castle buzzed with activity. Blacksmiths repaired damaged armor. Messengers galloped through the gates. Women prepared food for another company of soldiers leaving before sunset. Alara wandered among them, carrying baskets, delivering water, and thanking every warrior she passed. One young recruit looked no older than 16. His hands shook as he adjusted his helmet. Are you scared? She asked. The young soldier laughed nervously. A little. She reached into the pocket of her dress. Inside was a tiny piece of blue ribbon. My mother says brave people still get scared. She tied the ribbon around his wrist. There. Now you won't be alone. The young soldier smiled. I'll bring it back. No. Alara shook her head. Bring yourself back. The recruit bowed his head. I'll try. Several nobles watched from a nearby balcony. None of them smiled. One whispered quietly, she's too soft. Another nodded. The people need a wolf, not a healer. Neither realized Rowan had overheard every word. That evening, the council reconvened. This time, the atmosphere felt heavier. Master Torin placed several sealed letters on the table. They're from our western lords. Rowan broke the first seal. Then another. Then another. Each carried the same concern. Confidence in the throne was weakening. Not because Rowan had failed, because fear had begun rewriting people's judgment. General Darius slammed one letter onto the table. This is madness. They're talking about a child. They're talking about the future. Master Torin answered. They believe perception can destroy a kingdom long before an army ever does. Rowan remained silent. He knew they weren't truly discussing Alara. They were discussing fear. And fear rarely listened to reason. Underscore night settled over Ashmore. The royal family gathered for supper. For the first time all day, the castle felt peaceful. Queen Lyra laughed as Alara proudly announced she had convinced the castle cook to let her knead bread. It wasn't very round, Alara admitted, but everyone still ate it. Her older brothers laughed. One teased, I think the chickens would have eaten it first. Alara stuck out her tongue. They liked it. Even Rowan laughed. For a little while, the war disappeared. The council disappeared. The weight of the kingdom disappeared. They were simply a family. Queen Lyra reached across the table and placed another piece of bread onto Rowan's plate. You've barely eaten. I've had a great deal to think about. She gently squeezed his hand beneath the table. You don't have to carry everything alone. Before Rowan could answer, a loud knock echoed through the dining hall. Captain Aldrin entered. His face was pale. My Alpha, the Eastern Watchtower has fallen. Silence. Every smile disappeared. General alarm bells began ringing throughout the castle. Outside, soldiers rushed toward the armory. Messengers sprinted across the courtyard. Rowan slowly stood. His family watched him. Duty called once again. Alara hurried over before he reached the door. She wrapped both arms around his waist. Be careful. Rowan knelt in front of her. I always am. She studied his face carefully. You look sad. He forced a smile. I'm only tired. She gently placed the tiny carved wooden wolf into his hand. This helps me when I'm scared. You keep it. Rowan stared at the little carving. I can't. You can. She closed his fingers around it. So you'll remember to come home. For several long seconds, Rowan couldn't speak. Finally, He handed the wolf back. "I'll always come home to you." Elara smiled. She believed him. Rowan kissed her forehead before walking away. As the great doors closed behind him, Queen Lyra watched from the window. A strange feeling settled deep inside her heart. She couldn't explain it. She only knew some goodbyes never announce themselves before they become the last moments life will ever be the same. The great hall had never been so silent. Hundreds of people stood frozen. Warriors who had sworn to protect the Alpha. Servants who had watched the little princess take her first steps. Elders who had blessed her birth. None of them dared speak. At the foot of the Alpha's throne stood 6-year-old Elara Ashwin. Her tiny hands clutched the small carved wooden wolf her mother had given her only weeks before. She looked around the hall with frightened eyes. No one would look back at her. Finally, she looked at her father. "Father!" Her voice trembled. "Did I do something wrong?" Alpha Rowan closed his eyes. Every instinct told him to run to his daughter. To lift her into his arms. To tell the council they could keep their kingdom if saving it meant sacrificing his child. But every report of burned villages, every grieving family, every warning from the council echoed inside his mind. His people believed fear demanded a sacrifice, and he had convinced himself they were right. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "Princess Elara Ashwin, by decree of the Alpha, you are banished from the kingdom of Ashmore." The words echoed across the chamber. Elara blinked. She looked around the room in confusion. "Banished? What does that mean?" No one answered. She looked back at Rowan. "Father, when can I come home?" Rowan's heart shattered. He couldn't answer. Not because he didn't know, because no answer could ever make this right. Captain Aldrin stepped forward. His eyes glistened with tears. "My princess, we should go." Elara didn't move. She looked at every face inside the hall. General Darius lowered his head. Master Torin stared at the floor. The servants quietly cried. Even the guards standing beside the doors could no longer hide their tears. Only then did Elara begin to understand. They were really sending her away. She slowly walked toward the enormous palace doors. Halfway there, she stopped, turned around, looked at her father one last time. Her tiny voice barely rose above a whisper. "Is anyone coming with me?" Silence. Not one person moved. Not one voice answered. Not one hand reached toward her. The little girl nodded slowly. Then she turned away. The palace doors opened. Captain Aldrin walked beside her. As Elara crossed the courtyard, every citizen of Ashmore stood watching. No one shouted. No one protested. Fear had stolen even their courage. The massive eastern gates slowly opened. Elara looked back one final time. She smiled sadly. Not because she understood, because she still believed her father would stop everything before it was too late. He didn't. The gates closed behind her. The sound echoed across Ashmore like the ending of an age. Elara stood on the dusty road outside the kingdom. She stared at the gates. Surely her father would come. She waited. The morning passed. The afternoon disappeared. The evening sun slowly slipped behind the mountains. Every few minutes she stood, brushed the dust from her dress, and smiled hopefully toward the gates. He'll come now. He never did. As darkness settled across the valley, the little wooden wolf slipped from her hands onto the roadside. She never noticed. For the first time in her life, Princess Elara Ashwin fell asleep beneath the open sky, still believing tomorrow her father would come for her. Hidden among the trees overlooking the road, Captain Aldrin never left. He had watched her every moment. Rowan's command echoed inside his mind. "Take the child beyond our borders. Leave her there." He had obeyed the first order. He could not obey the second. When night had fully fallen, he quietly approached. He removed his heavy cloak and gently covered the sleeping child. Elara slowly opened her eyes. "Captain Aldrin?" He smiled softly. "I'm here." Relief filled her face. "I knew father would send someone. When is he coming?" The question pierced his heart. He wanted to tell her the truth. He couldn't. Instead, he lifted her gently into his arms. "We're going somewhere safe." She looked over his shoulder toward Ashmore. "He'll find us tomorrow." Aldrin swallowed hard. "I hope so." It was the first lie he had ever spoken to the little princess. For weeks, they wandered across forests and mountains. Aldrin sold his horse for food. He traded his sword for blankets before winter arrived. Each night, Alara asked the same question. "Do you think Father misses me?" Aldrin always answered carefully. "A father never stops loving his child." She smiled. "I knew it." He turned away so she wouldn't see the tears in his eyes. One cold evening, they reached a small mountain village. An elderly woman repaired a broken fence outside a modest cottage. She looked up as they approached. Aldrin bowed respectfully. "My name is Captain Aldrin. I've brought someone who needs a home." The old woman looked at Alara. The child's dress was torn. Her cheeks were pale. Her eyes still searched every road leading south. "What is your name?" "Alara." The woman smiled warmly. "I'm Lady Miriam. You look hungry." Alara nodded. Lady Miriam opened her front door. "Then you've come to the right place." Without realizing it, Alara stepped into the home that would raise her into the woman she was destined to become. Thick. The first winter nearly broke them. Food was scarce. Firewood ran low. The roof leaked whenever snow began melting. There were nights when all three shared one bowl of thin vegetable soup. Yet every evening, Alara quietly pushed half of her bread toward Lady Miriam. "You should eat." Lady Miriam smiled. "So should you." "I'm not hungry." Lady Miriam laughed gently. "My dear, your stomach is louder than your voice." Together, they shared everything, even when there wasn't enough. Some. The years passed quietly. Royal lessons became farm work. Silk dresses became patched wool clothes. Castle feasts became homemade bread. Alara learned to milk goats, harvest crops, bake bread, repair fences, carry water from the river. Lady Miriam often reminded her, "No honest work makes anyone smaller. It only makes the heart stronger." Alara believed her. Shas. Not everyone welcomed the banished princess. Some whispered as she passed. Her own father rejected her. There must have been something wrong with her. Children repeated what adults believed. The words hurt, especially at first. One afternoon, Alara returned home in tears. "I wish people knew who I really am." Lady Miriam sat beside her. "They will." "How?" "Not because you tell them, but because you show them." Those words became the foundation of Alara's life. Years later, the river burst its banks after weeks of relentless rain. A nearby village became trapped by rising floodwaters. The old bridge collapsed. Families screamed for help. Without hesitation, Alara tied a rope around her waist. "If I fall, don't let go." Again and again, she crossed the raging river. She carried frightened children, helped elderly villagers, guided exhausted parents through the rushing current. Hour after hour, she refused to stop. When the flood finally retreated, every family had survived. An elderly carpenter stood looking at the broken bridge. Then he looked at Alara. "We can rebuild the bridge tomorrow." He smiled through tears. "But today, you became one." From that day forward, kingdom after kingdom knew her by only one name: the bridge builder. Cart. The years continued passing. Whenever villages argued, she reunited them. Whenever famine struck, she organized neighboring towns to share what little they had. Whenever disaster came, she always arrived before hope disappeared. People followed her because she never asked for followers. She simply served, met. But one wound never healed. Every year, on the anniversary of her banishment, Alara climbed the highest hill overlooking the distant mountains. Beyond them, hidden from sight, lay Ashmore. She always asked herself the same questions. Did Father ever regret his decision? Did he ever search for me? Did he ever stand at those gates hoping I would return? Lady Miriam never interrupted those quiet moments. Sometimes, the greatest kindness was allowing someone to grieve. In 20 years after the gates of Ashmore closed behind a frightened little girl, a weary messenger rode into the village. His exhausted horse stumbled to a halt outside Lady Miriam's cottage. He climbed down and hurried toward Ilara. "My lady, I've ridden for 3 days." She immediately recognized the urgency in his voice. "What has happened?" He lowered his head. "Blackstone has begun conquering the northern kingdoms. Every kingdom in its path has fallen." He looked directly into her eyes. "And Ashmore will be next." Silence filled the cottage. 20 years of memories rushed back all at once. The kingdom that had abandoned her. The father she had never stopped loving. The people who had watched her leave without saying a word. Lady Miriam quietly stepped beside her. "You don't owe them anything." Ilara looked toward the southern mountains where Ashmore waited beyond the horizon. Then she answered with the same compassion that had defined her entire life. "I don't." She took a slow breath. "But innocent people still live there. And they shouldn't have to pay for yesterday." For the first time in 20 years, Ilara Ashwin began the journey home. 20 years had changed almost everything. The frightened little girl who had once walked through Ashmore's eastern gate with tears running down her face had become a woman whose name carried hope across kingdoms. Few people remembered her as Princess Ilara anymore. Most simply called her the bridge builder. Not because she built bridges of stone, but because she rebuilt broken people. Where families had stopped speaking, she restored peace. Where villages had been divided by fear, she reunited them. Where disaster had left strangers suspicious of one another, she reminded them that survival began with compassion. She never asked people what they had been, only who they could become. That was why kings respected her, why ordinary people trusted her, and why stories about her had spread farther than any army ever could. As the afternoon sun settled over the hills surrounding Ashmore, Ilara finally saw the kingdom she had not laid eyes on for 20 years. She gently slowed her horse. The stone walls stood exactly where memory had left them. The watchtowers still overlooked the valley. The silver wolf banners still danced in the wind. Only she had changed. Lady Miriam guided her horse beside hers. "You've become awfully quiet." Ilara smiled faintly. "I spent years imagining this moment. And now, I don't know whether I'm coming home or returning to the place that broke my heart." Lady Miriam rested a comforting hand on her arm. "Sometimes they're the same place." The eastern gate stood open. A young guard stepped forward. He couldn't have been older than 20. He smiled politely. "Welcome to Ashmore. What brings you here?" Ilara climbed from her horse. For a brief moment, she considered hiding her identity. She could enter unnoticed, avoid the whispers, avoid the memories. Instead, she looked directly into the young man's eyes. "My name is Ilara Ashwin." The guard froze. His smile slowly disappeared. His eyes widened. "The princess," he whispered the words, as though speaking a legend. You really came back." Ilara nodded gently. "I did." The young guard stood speechless for several seconds. Then, to Ilara's surprise, his eyes filled with tears. "I wasn't alive when you were banished. My mother was." He swallowed hard. "She told me about that day every year. She always said, if the princess ever comes home, someone must finally welcome her the way she should have been welcomed 20 years ago." He stepped aside, straightened his uniform, placed one hand over his heart, then bowed deeply. "Welcome home, princess." The world seemed to stop. For 20 years, those were the words Ilara had quietly accepted she would never hear. She smiled through tears she hadn't expected. "Thank you." As she crossed beneath the eastern gate, it no longer felt like she was returning to the kingdom that had rejected her. It felt like the kingdom itself had taken its first step toward asking forgiveness. News spread across Ashmore within minutes. "The princess has returned. Lady Ilara is home. The bridge builder is here." Merchants stepped away from their stalls. Blacksmiths left their forges. Children climbed fences and barrels trying to catch a glimpse of the woman their grandparents had spoken about for 2 decades. Some stared in amazement. Others lowered their heads, because they remembered, or because they had inherited the shame of those who did. Near the old marketplace fountain, an elderly woman accidentally dropped her basket. Apples rolled across the street. Without hesitation, Elara knelt to gather them. The old woman stared at her trembling hands. "I know you." Elara smiled warmly. "I remember you too. You used to sew winter cloaks for the castle." The woman nodded. Then tears began streaming down her face. "I stood right here, the day they took you away. I watched. I cried. But I said nothing." Her voice broke beneath the weight of 20 years. "I've asked God to forgive me every single day since." The marketplace fell silent. Dozens of people stopped what they were doing. No one interrupted. Elara gently placed the apples back into the woman's basket. Then she took both of the woman's shaking hands. "You cannot change yesterday." The woman nodded. "I know. But today," Elara smiled softly, "you had the courage to tell the truth, and that matters." The elderly woman could no longer hold back her tears. She embraced Elara tightly. One by one, others stepped forward. A blacksmith, a baker, a shepherd, a former palace servant. Each carried the same burden, the burden of silence. No one asked for excuses. They asked only for forgiveness. And one by one, Elara gave it. Not because they deserved it, but because she refused to let yesterday continue deciding who they would become tomorrow. Inside the castle, Captain Garrick hurried through the council chamber doors. "My Alpha." Rowan looked up from a table covered with military reports. "What is it?" Captain Garrick drew a careful breath. "She's here." The room fell completely silent. General Darius slowly rose. "Who?" Captain Garrick looked directly at Rowan. "Lady Elara." For several long moments, Rowan didn't move. 20 years of regret crashed into a single heartbeat. He slowly reached inside his cloak. His fingers found something small, something carefully preserved despite the passing years. A faded blue ribbon. The same ribbon little Elara had once tied around the wrist of a frightened young soldier before he marched to war. The soldier never returned. His family had quietly brought the ribbon back to the castle. Rowan had kept it ever since. Whenever guilt became unbearable, he held it in his hand. A reminder that while others saw weakness, his daughter had always seen people. He closed his fingers around the ribbon, then quietly slipped it back inside his cloak. Without saying another word, he walked out of the chamber. The marketplace had grown crowded. Yet the moment Rowan arrived, the crowd instinctively stepped aside. No command was given, no announcement made. The people simply understood. This meeting belonged to a father and his daughter. Across the square, Elara slowly turned. Their eyes met. 20 years disappeared. The noise disappeared. The marketplace disappeared. Only two broken hearts remained. Rowan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. No apology seemed large enough. No explanation seemed worthy. Finally, he whispered, "I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again." Elara studied the man standing before her. He looked older, wearier. The certainty that had once defined him had been replaced by quiet regret. "I wasn't sure either." Silence settled between them. Not an angry silence, a healing one. Neither rushed forward. Neither pretended 20 years could disappear in a single embrace. Some bridges required patience before anyone dared cross them. That evening, Elara declined the royal carriage waiting outside the castle. Instead, she walked through the streets. She helped laborers repair damaged homes. She carried timber beside carpenters. She shared supper with families who had lost loved ones during the war. Children laughed around her. Elderly couples smiled. Neighbors worked together without being asked. From the castle balcony, General Darius watched quietly. "I believed authority created loyalty." He looked toward the streets below. "I've spent 30 years trying to command people." He watched Elara lifting stones beside ordinary villagers. She simply serves them, and they would follow her anywhere. Rowan never took his eyes off his daughter, because people never remember who stood above them. He smiled sadly. They remember who stood beside them. Far beyond Ashmore, inside the fortress of Blackstone, Alpha Varric Blackthorn listened. As a scout finished his report, "The princess has returned. The people are gathering around her. They trust her." Varric slowly walked toward the great war map. His finger rested upon Ashmore. "So," he smiled faintly, "the daughter finally came home." The scout waited. "My Alpha, should we continue preparing to destroy Rowan?" Varric looked toward the distant mountains. "No." His voice remained calm. I've already defeated Rowan. He tapped the map once. Our true battle begins now. He looked directly at the scout. Lady Alara Ashwin is the only person capable of saving Ashmore. His smile disappeared. And that makes her my greatest enemy. Hope returned to Ashmore. Not because the war had ended. It hadn't. Blackstone continued advancing through the eastern territories, and every messenger who rode into the capital carried another report of villages under attack. Yet something inside the kingdom had changed. People no longer waited for orders before helping one another. Farmers rebuilt burned fields together. Blacksmiths repaired plows before swords. Merchants fed strangers before counting coins. Children gathered stones beside grown men, rebuilding broken walls. Without asking for a crown, Alara had become the heart of Ashmore. Every morning before sunrise, she left the castle alone. She preferred listening to ordinary people instead of attending endless council meetings. She walked through villages still scarred by war. She helped rebuild homes. She comforted grieving families. She planted crops beside exhausted farmers. One afternoon, a little boy carving pieces of wood looked up as she passed. "My lady," he held up a tiny wooden wolf. "My grandfather said every child should remember your story." Alara stared at the carving. For a brief moment, her hand instinctively moved toward the empty place where she had once carried her own wooden wolf. She smiled. "It's beautiful." The boy grinned proudly. "I want to grow up brave like you." Alara gently shook her head. "No." She placed the little wolf back into his hands. "Grow up kind. When kindness survives, courage always follows." General Darius had watched the exchange from nearby. Quietly, he smiled. Far away inside Blackstone, Alpha Varric Blackthorn stood before an enormous war table. Wooden figures marked every road, village, and mountain surrounding Ashmore. One general stepped forward. "My Alpha, the people of Ashmore are rebuilding faster than expected." Another added, "Our spies report that Lady Alara is responsible." Varric nodded. "I expected as much." He picked up one carved wolf from the map. "Tell me, what happens when compassion fails?" The generals remained silent. Varric answered his own question. People stopped believing in it. He gently placed the carved wolf at Birch Pass. "We will not defeat Alara by destroying her army. We will defeat her by destroying her certainty." 3 days later, a lone rider arrived beneath a white flag. Captain Garrick searched him thoroughly before allowing him inside the castle. The messenger bowed before Rowan. "I carry a message for Lady Alara." The room immediately grew tense. Alara accepted the sealed letter. There was no signature. She unfolded it. Only 3 lines had been written. "Your father once sacrificed his daughter to save a kingdom. Soon, you will sacrifice innocent people for that same kingdom. When that day comes, you'll finally understand why he chose fear instead of love." No one spoke. Alara quietly folded the letter. General Darius reached for it. "Who sent this?" She already knew. "Varric." Rowan slowly lowered his head. The words struck him as deeply as they struck her. For the first time in years, he saw his greatest mistake through his daughter's eyes. The following morning, Captain Garrick burst into the council chamber. "My Alpha, a refugee convoy is trapped inside Birch Pass." He spread a map across the table. "Nearly 200 people, mostly elderly. Many cannot walk without assistance." General Darius immediately pointed toward the southern road. "Close the pass. Redirect them." Captain Garrick frowned. "The southern route adds 3 days. They won't survive." The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes slowly turned toward Alara. She studied the map. If Birch Pass remained open, Blackstone might discover the route. If it closed, hundreds of innocent people would almost certainly die. Varric's letter echoed inside her mind. "Soon, you will sacrifice innocent people." She closed her eyes, then quietly answered, "We leave Birch Pass open." General Darius looked at her carefully. "My lady, there is risk." "I know." She looked around the room. "If leadership begins by abandoning the weakest among us, then we've already become the kingdom we once promised never to be again." No one argued. The order was given. Birch Pass remained open. 2 days later, the refugees arrived safely. Children embraced grandparents they believed were already dead. Families collapsed into grateful tears. One elderly man kissed Alara's hands. "You saved us." She smiled softly. No, we simply refuse to leave you behind. For one beautiful afternoon, hope seemed stronger than fear. Then everything changed. Before sunset, an exhausted scout staggered through the castle gates. His horse collapsed beneath him. Captain Garrick caught the young man before he hit the ground. What happened? The scout struggled to breathe. They knew Birch Pass would stay open. The council chamber froze. General Darius stepped forward. How? The scout swallowed hard. They wanted us to leave it open. Silence. Captain Garrick stared at him. What are you saying? The scout looked directly at Alara. It was never about the refugees. It was a trap. They allowed the convoy to escape, because they knew we'd protect them. While everyone watched Birch Pass, Blackstone crossed the hollow ridge. Every face inside the chamber turned pale. They attacked Redbrook. Captain Garrick's voice barely worked. Captain Edric, the scout slowly removed a silver wolf insignia from his pocket, then placed it on the council table. No explanation followed. None was needed. Captain Edric, 32 civilians, and 12 Ashmore soldiers were gone. That night, 32 candles burned inside the memorial hall. Alara stood before them alone. The names blurred together through tears. Captain Edric, old Mrs. Harlan, little Tomas. Families she had spoken with only days earlier. She remembered Varick's letter. Soon, you will sacrifice innocent people. Her breathing grew heavier. What if, she whispered into the silence, what if he was right? What if compassion only gives evil people more ways to hurt others? No answer came. Only the flickering of candlelight. Only grief. Only doubt. From the doorway, Rowan watched quietly. He had never seen his daughter look so small. 20 years earlier, he had stood in almost the same darkness, believing one terrible decision might save thousands. Now, she carried exactly the same burden, not because she lacked strength, because leadership demanded impossible choices. For the first time, Rowan understood something he had missed for 20 years. His greatest mistake had never been choosing between his daughter and the kingdom. His greatest mistake had been believing those were the only two choices. He quietly turned away, not because he had no words, because no father should interrupt the battle taking place inside his daughter's heart. Far beyond Ashmore, Varick stood overlooking his army. A messenger approached. My Alpha. The reports from Redbrook are confirmed. And Lady Alara? The messenger smiled. She blames herself. Varick nodded. Good. He watched thousands of soldiers assembling below. The strongest walls fall long after hope does. He raised his hand. War horns echoed across the valley. Blackstone's banners rose together. The final march begins. Below him, an entire army started moving toward Ashmore. Above them, dark storm clouds gathered over the kingdom. For the first time since returning home, Ilara wondered whether compassion alone could truly save the people she loved. Ashmore did not awaken to celebration. It awakened to grief. 32 homes remained silent. 32 families set empty places at their tables. Captain Edric's sword rested beside a coffin draped in silver. Little Thomas's wooden toys remained untouched in his mother's house. The victory at Birch Pass no longer felt like a victory. It felt like a question no one could answer. Was compassion enough? Or had it become a weakness that clever enemies could always exploit? The question spread through Ashmore, but no one spoke it aloud, because they knew who was asking it most. Ilara. She disappeared before sunrise. No guards accompanied her. No servants knew where she had gone. By midday, the castle was searching. Captain Garrick checked the northern forests. General Darius searched the training grounds. Kalen rode every road leading from the capital. Even Rowan joined the search himself. As evening approached, Lady Miriam quietly saddled her horse. I know where she is. Beyond the eastern gate. Past the old oak tree. Past the place where the road disappeared over the hill. Ilara sat alone. Exactly where Captain Aldrin had left her 20 years earlier. She stared toward the distant horizon. The same horizon she had once crossed as a frightened little girl. Lady Miriam said nothing. She simply sat beside her. Several minutes passed. Only the wind spoke. Finally, Ilara broke the silence. I made the right decision. Lady Miriam nodded. You did. People still died. They did. I saved hundreds. You did. I still feel responsible. Lady Miriam looked toward the old road. So did your father. Ilara closed her eyes. I finally understand him. More silence. Then Ilara whispered, what if Varric is right? What if kindness only creates more opportunities for cruel people? Lady Miriam smiled gently. Your father once believed sacrificing one innocent life would save thousands. She looked directly at Ilara. Don't make the same mistake. Ilara frowned. I don't understand. Lady Miriam reached for her hand. He believed every burden belonged to him. You've begun believing every death belongs to you. They don't. The difference between guilt and responsibility is something every leader must learn. She squeezed Ilara's hand. You are responsible for your choices. You are not responsible for another man's evil. Tears slowly rolled down Ilara's face. For the first time since Redbrook, she allowed herself to cry, not as a princess, not as a leader, simply as a daughter who had carried too much for too long. The following morning, Ashmore gathered once again, not because someone ordered them, because rebuilding had become part of who they were. Villages helped neighboring villages. Farmers shared seed with strangers. Blacksmiths repaired wagons before collecting payment. Children planted trees where battle had scarred the land. Hope quietly returned. General Darius stood before the Great Hall, wearing every military decoration he had earned across 3 decades of service. Hundreds of soldiers watched. So did Rowan. So did Ilara. Without speaking, Darius slowly removed the silver medal resting over his heart, the medal awarded after his greatest battlefield victory. He walked toward Ilara, then knelt. Gasps echoed through the square. He placed the medal at her feet. My greatest honor was never winning battles. He looked up. It was living long enough to learn what true strength looks like. I once believed this medal represented courage. He gently pushed it toward her. It doesn't. You do. The square remained completely silent. Ilara slowly picked up the medal, then placed it back into Darius' hands. No, she smiled warmly. You earned this. He looked confused. You defended this kingdom with strength. Now defend it with compassion too. Darius stood. For the first time in his long military career, he saluted someone with tears in his eyes. Late that afternoon, another familiar face entered Ashmore. Captain Aldrin. His armor was worn. His hair carried the weight of 20 years, yet his eyes remained unchanged. He stopped before Rowan. I disobeyed you. I know. I never asked forgiveness. I know. I couldn't leave her. Rowan stepped closer. And because you didn't, I still have a daughter. The 2 old soldiers embraced. Around them, the courtyard quietly applauded. That evening, Aldrin asked Ilara to walk with him. Together they wandered beyond the castle gardens. For several minutes neither spoke. Finally, Aldrin smiled. I have a confession. Ilara laughed softly. You? I wasn't as brave as everyone thinks. She looked at him curiously. What do you mean? The day I left you with Lady Miriam, I promised myself I'd never interfere with your life again. He chuckled quietly. I broke that promise before the year ended. Ilara frowned. I didn't understand. Every year, I returned. Her footsteps stopped. What? I never let you see me. I stayed far enough away. I only wanted to know one thing, that you were alive. His voice trembled. I watched your birthdays from a distance. I watched you become the woman your mother always believed you would become. He smiled through misting eyes. You never needed protecting. I only needed to know you were happy. Ilara threw her arms around him. For 20 years, she had believed everyone had forgotten her. And now she discovered someone had quietly kept watch all along. Meanwhile, Kalen prepared another convoy leaving before dawn. He found Ilara waiting beside his horse. Without saying a word, he removed an old brass compass hanging from his neck. It was scratched from years of travel. My mother's. He placed it into her hand. If I don't come back, you'll always know the road home. Ilara looked at the compass. I don't want this. I do. He smiled. Because I plan on asking for it back. For the first time in days, Ilara laughed. I'll hold you to that. The following morning, every citizen of Ashmore gathered inside the great square. Rowan stepped forward. No royal cloak. No ceremonial sword. No crown. Only a father carrying 20 years of regret. His voice echoed across the square. 20 years ago, I believed saving my kingdom required sacrificing my daughter. I was wrong. He looked directly at Alara. I taught Ashmore to fear compassion. My daughter taught Ashmore how to live again. His voice broke. I cannot undo what I stole from her. I cannot return the years. But before my people, and before my daughter, I ask forgiveness. Silence settled across the square. One by one, the people stepped forward. A baker, a shepherd, a widow, a blacksmith, soldiers, children, each confessed the same truth. We were afraid. We remained silent. We failed you. When the final apology ended, Alara looked across the faces before her. I forgive you. She paused. But forgiveness isn't the end. It's the beginning. If we truly want to honor everyone we've lost, then let us become the kind of kingdom where no child ever stands alone again. The people joined hands. Neighbors embraced. Old divisions disappeared. Ashmore no longer resembled a kingdom held together by fear. It had become a family held together by compassion. Underscore. Before dawn the next morning, 3 warning horns echoed from the eastern watchtower. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward the valley. Across the horizon, Blackstone's banners stretched farther than anyone could count. An army unlike anything Ashmore had ever faced slowly emerged through the morning mist. Rowan stood beside Alara upon the castle wall. Neither reached for a weapon. Neither spoke. They already knew. Everything they had rebuilt would now be tested. And somewhere beyond the sea of black banners, Alpha Varric waited, confident that fear would win the final battle. He had no idea that he was no longer marching against a kingdom. He was marching against a family. Dawn arrived beneath a sky wrapped in cold gray clouds. The valley between Ashmore and Blackstone stretched into the distance like a scar carved across the earth. On one side stood Ashmore, not just soldiers, farmers, blacksmiths, teachers, healers, hunters, parents, children old enough to remember why this battle had to end. No one stood there because they had been forced to. They stood there because they had chosen one another. On the opposite ridge, Blackstone waited. Thousands of disciplined warriors stood motionless beneath black banners, every shield perfectly aligned, every sword sharpened, every eye fixed upon one woman. At the center of the formation stood Alpha Varric Blackthorn, calm, unmoving, patient, as though he had already seen how the day would end. Underscore General Darius stepped beside Alara. The army is ready. Captain Garrick drew his sword. They're waiting for your command. Every warrior looked toward their princess. Instead of reaching for her sword, Alara slowly unfastened it from her belt. She turned toward Rowan. Without speaking, she placed it in his hands. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. My lady, Captain Garrick whispered. Alara looked toward the battlefield. If I walk into that valley carrying a sword, I've already accepted Varric's way of thinking. She reached for a folded white banner resting against the castle wall. Today, she intended to fight for something greater than victory. Underscore. Holding the white banner, Alara walked alone toward the center of the valley. Thousands watched. No drums sounded. No horns echoed. Only the quiet rhythm of her footsteps. When she reached the open ground between the armies, she planted the banner firmly into the earth. The wind caught the white cloth. It fluttered gently between 2 kingdoms preparing for war. Alara raised her voice. When I was 6 years old, my own kingdom believed compassion made me too weak to belong. She looked first toward Ashmore, then toward Blackstone. 20 years later, the people standing behind me discovered something greater than strength. They discovered each other. Silence spread across the valley. She turned toward Blackstone. You've been taught that fear creates loyalty. It doesn't. It creates obedience. Loyalty is born from love, trust, and hope. She paused. Fear always demands another sacrifice. Compassion asks us to protect one another. Varric slowly stepped forward. His expression remained almost gentle, so certain, so hopeful. He looked directly into Alara's eyes. Tell me, when Birch Pass fell, did compassion protect Captain Edric? The valley grew still. You chose mercy. 32 innocent people died. He took another step. Your father sacrificed 1 daughter to save a kingdom. You sacrificed 32 lives to save strangers. His voice became quieter. So tell me, Which one of you is truly different? The words struck harder than any blade. For a brief moment, Ilara saw the memorial candles, Captain Edric's insignia, the grieving families. She lowered her eyes. Varric smiled. He had found the wound he wanted. You've become exactly what he was. A leader who sacrifices people while calling it compassion. Silence. Even Ashmore's soldiers held their breath. Then Ilara slowly looked back up. Tears shimmered in her eyes. I carry those 32 names every day. My heart always will. She took a slow breath. But there's one difference between us. I never stopped mourning them. I never stopped believing every life mattered. My compassion didn't fail. It broke my heart. And I'd rather live with a broken heart than one that feels nothing at all. For the first time, Varric's confidence faltered. Underscore. He raised one hand. Archers. Hundreds of bows lifted. Arrowheads pointed directly at Ilara. Captain Garrick instinctively stepped forward. Rowan caught his arm. No, they'll kill her. Rowan's eyes never left his daughter. Then she'll know. Someone finally believed in what she stood for. Underscore. Varric spoke one final time. Kneel. Tell your people compassion is a lie. I'll spare them. Ilara smiled sadly. No. I'd rather die speaking the truth than live teaching fear. Varric's face hardened. Release. No arrows flew. The archers remained motionless. I gave an order. One young archer lowered his bow. My alpha. I can't. Another followed. Then another. Soon, hundreds of bows slowly touched the ground. An older Blackstone soldier stepped forward. I joined your army to protect my family, not murder someone who came here carrying peace. Another removed his helmet. So did I. One after another. Weapons fell into the grass. Fear began losing the battle it had ruled for decades. Underscore. Varric's eyes burned with fury. You are weak. No. An elderly Blackstone captain answered quietly. We're simply tired. We've buried enough sons. We've buried enough fathers. We're done. Realizing his army was slipping away, Varric drew his sword. If fear no longer controls you, I will. He charged. Behind him, his elite guard rushed forward. Unlike the rest of the army, they remained fiercely loyal. The peaceful silence shattered. Steel crashed against steel. General Darius met the first wave. Captain Garrick defended the white banner. Captain Aldrin fought beside Rowan for the first time in 20 years. The battle was smaller than anyone expected, but far more personal. Underscore Varric broke through the fighting. His sword raced toward Ilara. Before it reached her, Rowan stepped between them. The blades collided. The impact threw Rowan backward. Varric's sword tore across Rowan's shoulder. Blood stained his armor. He dropped to one knee. Varric raised his sword again. Before he could strike, Captain Aldrin slammed into him from the side. The blow sent Varric stumbling. Not this time, Aldrin growled. I failed to protect her once. I won't fail again. General Darius and Captain Garrick joined him. Together, the four men stood between Ilara and the last of Varric's elite warriors. One by one, the guards looked around. Their army had already laid down its weapons. They lowered theirs as well. The battle was over. Not because someone had been destroyed, because fear had finally run out of followers. Underscore. Varric slowly looked across the valley. His perfectly disciplined army had chosen compassion over obedience. He laughed once. A tired, broken laugh. So this is what defeats me. No, Ilara answered gently. You defeated yourself. The day you stopped believing people could choose love over fear. Varric looked around one final time. For the first time in his life, he had nothing left to command. He quietly dropped his sword, and the valley became silent once more. A lone figure stepped forward from the crowd. It was Finn, no longer the little village boy who had watched Ilara disappear beyond the eastern gate. His hands shook as he held out a small carved wooden wolf. The wood had darkened with age. One ear had been repaired. Tiny cracks had been carefully sealed. Ilara stared at it. My wolf. Finn smiled through tears. I found it, after you left. I couldn't bear to leave it lying in the road. He gently placed it into her hands. Every year, I repaired it. Whenever it cracked, I fixed it. People laughed at me. They said you'd never come back. He smiled. I told them, someone has to keep hope alive until she finds her way home. Alara could no longer hold back her tears. She held the little wooden wolf against her heart. For 20 years, someone she barely knew had protected the last piece of her childhood. Rowan slowly struggled to his feet. His shoulder bled heavily, yet his eyes never left his daughter. 20 years earlier, he had watched her walk away alone. Today, he walked toward her. Without hesitation, he held out his hand. No title, no ceremony, no command. Only a father asking for one final chance. Alara looked at his hand, then at the people surrounding them. Ashmore, Blackstone, 2 kingdoms forever changed. She smiled, placed her hand in his. Together, they walked toward the open gates of Ashmore. Behind them, Blackstone soldiers helped Ashmore heal the wounded. Ashmore healers treated Blackstone children. Former enemies carried the injured side by side. No one asked which kingdom they belonged to, only who still needed help. As the white banner continued dancing in the morning wind, the people witnessed something greater than the end of a war. They witnessed the beginning of a new way of living. The weakest daughter had not defeated an enemy. She had defeated the fear that had ruled 2 kingdoms for generations. And because of that, neither kingdom would ever be the same again. 6 months later, spring returned to Ashmore. The scars of war had not disappeared, but they no longer defined the kingdom. Where burned homes had once stood, new cottages now welcomed young families. The bridges destroyed during the invasion carried merchants, farmers, and children once again. The fields that had lain abandoned now swayed beneath golden waves of grain. Life had returned, not because the kingdom had forgotten its pain, because it had learned to grow beyond it. One crisp morning, the people of Ashmore gathered inside the great square, not for a celebration, not for a victory parade, but for something far more important, a new beginning. Alpha Rowan stood before the people, wearing neither his ceremonial armor nor his royal cloak. For the first time since becoming Alpha, he stood simply as a man who had learned from his greatest mistake. Behind him, carved into a newly raised stone monument, were words every child in Ashmore would one day memorize. Compassion preserves the pack. The old motto had guided generations through fear. The new one would guide them through hope. Rowan looked across the crowd before speaking. Kingdoms are not remembered because they never failed. They are remembered because they found the courage to become better. He stepped away from the monument, not as the center of attention, but as a father making room for the daughter who had changed them all. The people applauded as Alara stepped forward. She wore the same forest green cloak she had worn on the day she returned, the same worn boots, the same silver pendant that had belonged to her mother. Nothing about her suggested royalty. Everything about her reflected service. Rowan held out the royal crest of Ashmore. The throne is yours if you wish it. The entire square fell silent. Every eye turned toward Alara. She smiled softly before closing Rowan's hand around the crest once more. I don't need a throne to serve my people. She looked across the crowd. A leader's place isn't always above the people. Sometimes, it's right beside them. The square erupted into warm applause, not because she had refused power, because everyone believed her. In the months that followed, Ashmore changed in ways no law could have forced. Every village established a house where travelers, widows, and orphans would always find food and shelter. Young warriors spent part of every season helping rebuild roads, harvest crops, and care for the elderly before beginning military training. Children learned that courage meant protecting those who could not protect themselves. Strength was still respected, but compassion became the measure of greatness. One afternoon, Alara walked through the marketplace, carrying timber to a family rebuilding their home. Merchants greeted her by name. Children ran toward her with laughter. An elderly woman pressed a loaf of warm bread into her hands. You helped us when we had nothing. Please, let us help you now. Alara accepted it with a grateful smile. The kingdom had learned something beautiful. Compassion had become contagious. Near the eastern gate, a new wooden sign stood where soldiers had once guarded the entrance. Its message was simple: no child walks alone again. Every traveler entering Ashmore paused to read those words. Many asked what they meant. The people always answered with the same story. Not about a war, not about a victory, but about a little girl whose kindness had changed an entire kingdom. Underscore. As evening settled across the valley, Rowan walked toward the eastern gate. 20 years earlier, he had stood there watching his daughter disappear beyond the horizon. The memory had haunted him every day since. Now, he heard familiar footsteps behind him. Elara joined him without saying a word. Together, they looked beyond the open gates, toward the road that had once carried them apart. Families entered the kingdom laughing. Merchants waved as they passed. Children raced across the rebuilt bridge, pretending to be wolves protecting one another. The silence between father and daughter no longer carried regret. It carried peace. Rowan spoke quietly. I used to believe my greatest duty was protecting these walls. He looked toward the people filling the streets with life. You taught me my greatest duty was protecting the hearts inside them. Elara smiled. And now they protect one another. They always had the ability. They simply needed someone to remind them. Rowan nodded. And that someone was my daughter. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the mountains, bathing Ashmore in warm golden light. Father and daughter began walking through the open gates together. This time, no child was being sent away. No family was being torn apart. No kingdom was choosing fear over love. Behind them, children laughed as they ran across the rebuilt bridge. Ahead of them, a future waited that would never again mistake compassion for weakness. And for generations to come, whenever the people of Ashmore told the story of the kingdom's greatest leader, they never began with the battles she fought. They began with the little girl who had every reason to hate, yet chose to love instead. Because in the end, the weakest daughter had not only saved the pack that betrayed her, she had taught it what it truly meant to become a family.